Thank you, Miss Cameron. Right, we're going to move on from chapter 1, beautifully read by Miss Cameron, to chapter 2, the first day. The boy and girl struggled up the last slope of the hill. He was limping a little, and every so often bent down to touch his knee. His sister held his other hand and half pulled him with her. They were anxious to get to the barn, away from the sharp bursts of wind and rain that bullied them from all sides, it seemed. Yet they were apprehensive too, at the thought of having to face what had to be faced. Yesterday their mother and father had brought sacks of food and all manner of bits and pieces from their cottage up to the barn, and had returned to them weary and worried. They had been warned to go to no one's house, to speak to no one, to keep to their own yard, and that was all. And now today, Mother had sent them on with their older sister, and had told them that she and their father would come up to the barn to join them when they had finished sorting through their belongings. But how sadly she had pushed them away from her, and how desolate their home had seemed, with all their possessions gone. As they came up the last slope towards a little field, they knew at the top of the field the boy started to run, remembering his earlier journeys to this very barn to see his shepherd friend Clem, and to help him with the newborn lambs. Those had been better days than this. For a moment he forgot his knee and brought his sister running with him. "Clem may be here, he's my friend," he said, and he shouted, "Clem, Clem," as he always did. He pushed open the barn door eagerly, and in came his sister after him, laughing and panting for breath, and she swung the door to, behind her. It was dark in the barn, except for a light in one corner, and that made the darkness seem even deeper. The light moved towards them, and they saw that it was the light of a candle, and that their sister Catherine was carrying it. For a second the other two stared at her, surprised to see her like this, looking as if she had made the barn her home. The hem of her long skirt was damp with mud from when she had crossed the lower stream in the bottom field near their farm. She clutched her shawl round her against the cold that they had brought in with them. "'Tis time and all. Clem been here, Dan. But what a pair of tortoises thou'rt, leaving me to do all the work. 'Tis right good, that." "I fell, Catherine," Dan explained. "See, where I cut myself." He rolled back the hem of his trouser carefully to show his knee glistening with the ooze of blood and smeared with dirt. Catherine bent down to touch it, and he winced away from her. "Tessa stopped to help me," he added through his tears. Catherine smiled up at him. "Did she now? Well then, Tessa can bathe it for thee and all. There's a trickle stream round back. But get dry clothes on first, there on the straw. I've laid them out for thee." Dan glanced at Tessa, then struggled out of his shirt and trousers and put on the rough woolen sack clothes that had been brought up for him. Catherine put his wet things on a low beam at the back of the barn, while Tessa changed into the long black skirt and warm shawl that were ready. As she put her apron on, she found a clean square of white linen in one of the pockets, and she knelt down to have another look at Dan's sore knee. "'Tis nothing," she pronounced. "Muck. That'll soon be gone." She spat on the cloth and rubbed in his knee, ignoring his squeaks. "Don't fuss, donkey." She laid the piece of cloth on the wound and bound it tightly round, too intent on making sure that it didn't slip down again to show much sympathy. Catherine was deep in her thoughts. It was as if she had a worry inside her that was too dreadful to be told. She lodged her candle in a crack in a large, flat-topped boulder. The crack was made up with wax, as though it had been used many times before for the same thing. Dan tried to remember whether he had ever seen the old shepherd Clem do this. He wondered if it was Clem's candle that Catherine was using. "This can be our table," said Catherine. "'Tis just the right shape, and smooth as wood." Outside the wind was moaning, but it was dry and sheltered in the barn. Now that they were used to the light, Dan and Tessa could see that the barn was really quite big, and that the strong beams that bound from end to end made it look as solid as their church. About a third of it was taken up with a huge mound of dry straw. Blankets from their beds at home were laid on them. So they were to stay the night then? They hadn't even known that. Lined up against one wall were some wooden bins, and these were crammed full and overflowing with apples and vegetables, cheeses wrapped in cloths, salted meats and cakes, oats and barley. Dan ran to rummage through them, excited again. "See these?" said Dan. "There's food for a feast here, Catherine." His sister slapped his hand as he reached into one bin for an apple. "Nay, not for a feast, and not for thee, mouth, so leave it." "Then who's it for, Catherine?" asked Tessa. "Isn't it from our house?" "Aye, it is. Father brought it all last night before he went to see Grant Tebbit." "But why so much, Kath?" "Because," the older girl sighed. How could she tell them what she didn't know herself for sure? Why couldn't they guess as much as she had done? Because I think 'tis to last for a long time, weeks and weeks. Everything's going funny, said Tessa. Everyone in the village seems sad and frightened, all since the Baker children died. People stay in their houses and no one comes to talk. Mother and father keep secrets from us. Mother cries, I know she does, and father does nothing to comfort her. And now we come up here. Are we to live here now? And why? Dan stared from one to the other of his sisters, not daring to interrupt their big talk. This was the mood he had seen in his parents when his mother kept still and quiet by the fireside and his father stopped singing. Don't ask me, said Catherine. I don't know. She sank down onto one of the blankets, overcome now with the day's tiredness. It would be a relief, at least, to share her worries and her guesses. I think something terrible is happening in the village, but I don't know what it is. There is sickness and there are more deaths than in the baker's house, that I do know. I think Mother and Father want us all to get away from it if we can, hide from it, if such a thing is possible, Catherine faltered. Whatever it is. But they are coming, aren't they? Whispered Dan at last. We won't be here on our own. Of course they're coming, little man. Catherine drew Dan down in the straw next to her. It was coarse and sharp through the fabric of his clothes, but after the long haul from the village in the rain it was comforting enough. That's all right then, he said. He stuck his thumb in his mouth and wriggled down inside the blanket. 'Twill be all right when Mother and Father come. How easy it was for Dan to fall asleep. After a while, Catherine went outside to look for her mother. The wind came in so fiercely when she tugged open the door that it would have blown out the candle if Tessa hadn't jumped up to shield the flame with her hands. Catherine closed the door as gently as she could and climbed up the little slope of the field. She crossed over the stretch of moor to the edge of the woods and to the path that plunged down in round rocks and ferns into the depths of the woodlands. Far below that, and out of sight behind the trees, lay the village that they had left hours before. Already daylight was dimming. Catherine cupped her hands round her mouth. Mother, she called, Mother! But the wind tossed her voice away from her so that even she couldn't hear it, and below her the great trees crashed their branches together in the storm's fury. The colours of autumn showed up in all their intensity in that strange wet light. A few yards below her, Catherine could see a bush with berries as bright as blood. She clambered down to it and snapped off one of the branches, then made her way slowly back to the barn. By the door there was a large boulder. She climbed up onto it and pushed the end of the branch as far as it would go into the crack between the two small stones that made up part of the wall of the barn. There, she said, that can keep away now, evil spirits. We want none of thee in here. The wind mocked her with its great roar, so that even as she jumped down from the boulder, the berries were torn from the branch to drop one by one by the ground. Maybe some berries still clung to the small twigs that were cupped in the little hollow that she had found for them. Catherine didn't have the heart to look. Rain spat from the dark sky. Catherine was thankful for the lull that came as she opened the barn door and for the dry warmth of the place and the kind light of the fluttering candle. She tiptoed past the straw pile where Dan and Tessa were lying quietly and hung her wet shawl on the low beam to dry. Tessa murmured half asleep, Has she come, Cathy? Not yet. Are they afraid? Catherine knelt down by her sister. Nay, she said softly, and nor must Tessa be. Mother will come. She said she would. She sat by Tessa a little while, then crept over to her own blanket in the straw. She lay listening to the light breathing of her brother and sister, and the sound was so comforting against the cruel moan of the wind that very soon she gave in to it and, like them, fell fast asleep.